Step into the dark with me, listeners. Lock your doors, draw the blinds, and let the outside world fade away into the shadows. Tonight, we are exploring the terrifying concept of absolute erasure. What does it actually mean to be wiped from the face of the earth? To have your identity, your memories, your name, and your very humanity stripped away until there is absolutely nothing left but a cold, clinical string of letters in a dusty archive. We like to believe that if we meet a violent, tragic end, someone will look for us. We trust that the systems built to protect us will, at the very least, remember us. But systems fail. People slip through the cracks. And sometimes, it takes decades before someone bothers to look down into the dark and pull them back out. Our journey tonight begins not in a bloody crime scene, but in the quiet, sterile glow of a computer screen. The year is 2014. Christina Skates, a 23-year-old biology student attending Cleveland State University, was sitting alone on a mundane afternoon. She was a woman with a highly methodical mind, someone who possessed a deep, almost obsessive passion for genealogy. Christina spent her free hours plunging into the depths of family histories, untangling the complicated webs of ancestry, and digging through digital archives. She was brilliant at it. She utilized complex cross-referencing, deep database mining, and advanced DNA tracing techniques that would make seasoned, veteran investigators pause and take notes. She possessed a natural, insatiable hunger for putting broken puzzles back together. On this particular afternoon, she was idly scrolling through digital cemetery records, just killing time. Line after line of names, dates, and final resting places flickered across her monitor. And then, her eyes hit line 82,483. The scrolling stopped. The room around her seemed to grow uncomfortably quiet. The entry listed a date of death, February 5th, 1975. But where a name should have been, where the identity of a human being should have been permanently etched into the historical record, there was only a chilling, 5-word description. Unknown white female bones. Christina sat frozen, staring at those words. A sudden, heavy weight settled in her chest. This wasn't just a typo. This was a human being. A woman who had been murdered, tossed away, and buried without a name, completely and utterly abandoned by society. For months, after that day, the phrase echoed in Christina's mind. It was a persistent, nagging whisper in the back of her head, constantly reminding her that something was fundamentally, horribly wrong. But what made this specific ledger entry feel like a personal haunting was the geography. Wait, this nameless victim wasn't found in some far-off, distant state. The remains had been discovered in Strongsville, Ohio, a mere 20-minute drive from where Christina herself had grown up. This was her home turf. This was a nightmare buried in her own backyard. To truly comprehend how a brutal murder was reduced to a mere footnote in a cemetery log, we have to travel back in time. We must rewind the clock to the bitter, freezing winter of 1975. It was February 15th. The Ohio air was violently cold, the kind of chill that bites through your coat and settles deep into your joints. 3 teenage boys were wandering through the desolate, frost-bitten woods along the rocky river inside the Mill Stream Run reservation. The trees were bare, the ground was hard, and the landscape was silent. As they kicked through the winter debris, one of the boys spotted something unnatural resting in the freezing mud. They approached cautiously, the breath plummeting from their mouths in the frigid air. Scattered across the freezing earth were skeletal remains. They were unmistakably human. Panic set in. Whether they were terrified of the police, or just paralyzed by the horrific reality of what they had stumbled upon. It took the teenagers a little while to finally report the grim discovery to the authorities. When the police finally arrived and began excavating the frozen ground, the nightmare only deepened. The remains had been brutally ravaged by the elements. Months of harsh, weather and aggressive animal scavenging had scattered the bones across the desolate woodland. Crucial pieces of the skeleton, were completely missing. The lower jaw, the mandible, was gone. Almost all of the teeth had been lost to the dirt, leaving only 5 intact, along with one wisdom tooth that had never erupted. But the skull remained, and the skull told a terrifying, violent story. Embedded deep inside the left temple was a single .25 caliber bullet. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't exposure. This was an execution. 3 days later, on February 12th, the coroner officially ruled the death a homicide. The medical examiners estimated the victim to be a young woman, roughly 20 years old. But without the rest of the remains, it was little more than an educated guess. Investigators knew they were looking at a young, white female who had been shot in the head and discarded like trash in the freezing woods. But who was she? The detectives in 1975 utilized every single tool available to them in that era, which, tragically, wasn't much tragically. They were so desperate for a lead that they even pulled photographs of Patty Hearst, who was dominating the national headlines at the time, hoping against hope that they had somehow stumbled onto the most famous missing person in the country. It was a massive, desperate reach, and of course, the dental records proved it was a dead end. They checked missing persons reports. Nothing fit. Wait. They waited for grieving parents to call the station. The phones remained silent. The investigation hit a brick wall at full speed. 3 months later, on May 15th, 1975, the system gave up. The fragmented bones of the young woman were packed away and transported to Memorial Garden Cemetery. She was buried in Potter's Field, a desolate, anonymous tract of land reserved for the unclaimed, the forgotten, and the unloved. There was no service. There were no tears. No family members stood by the grave to say goodbye. She was lowered into the earth beneath an unmarked stone, swallowed by the soil, and relegated to line 82,483 in a ledger book. Unknown white female bones. Decades bled away. Detectives grew old and retired. Evidence boxes were shipped into dark, climate-controlled storage rooms, gathering thick layers of dust. The murdered girl by the Rocky River was completely erased from the public consciousness. Until 2014, until a 23-year-old biology student refused to look away. Christina's academic training had hardwired her brain to ask questions, to relentlessly pull at loose threads until the fabric unraveled. Her friends jokingly called her an amateur detective, but her drive was entirely serious. She could not stomach the idea that a victim could be so thoroughly discarded. She began her crusade where any classic investigation starts, the archives. Christina spent grueling hours isolated in the quiet basements of local libraries. She hunched over glowing microfiche machines, the mechanical whir of the reels filling the silence as she scrolled through thousands of pages of decades-old newspapers. She was hunting for any scrap of ink, any forgotten headline from February 1975 that might hold a clue the police had missed. What she found was deeply disturbing. It wasn't that the information was wrong. It was that there was almost no information at all. A young woman had been shot in the head and dumped in a public reservation, and the local press had barely deemed it worthy of a passing mention. It was treated as just another nameless body. A chain though not worth the ink. Without media pressure, the public remained completely oblivious. No tips came in. No outrage was sparked. The press had failed her just as spectacularly as the justice system had met. Frustrated but undeterred, Christina pivoted to the authorities. She picked up the phone and began dialing. She called the Cleveland police. She called the Akron police. She called the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office. She slammed into bureaucratic walls at every turn. Some departments claimed they had absolutely no record of the incident. Others stated the files were incomplete. Most simply brushed her off, citing protocol, telling the persistent college student that cold case files were strictly confidential, and that formal requests would take months to process. Christina was confronting the infuriating reality of institutional red tape. She was learning firsthand how easily a cold case can remain frozen solid, guarded by a labyrinth of apathy and protocol designed to keep curious eyes out. But then, a crack formed in the wall. Christina managed to get a hold of Lieutenant Don Sylvius with the Cleveland Metroprax Police. Expecting another dismissal, Christina launched into her pitch, explaining her intense interest in the Strongsville Jane Doe. Lieutenant Sylvius didn't hang up. He listened. He heard the genuine, desperate concern in Christina's voice. He recognized her as knowledge of genealogical research. Sylvius made a decision that broke protocol, a decision that would alter the course of history. He realized that this case was going nowhere sitting in a box. If this determined student had the digital savvy to shake the trees, why not give her the wind to do it? Sylvius handed Christina the keys to the kingdom. He provided her with copies of the original, highly restricted case files. Suddenly, Christina was holding the nightmare in her hands. The faded, horrifying crime scene photographs, the muddy skull resting in the winter debris, the close-up forensic shots of the bullet hole fracturing the temple, the meticulous, clinical investigative notes that hadn't seen the light of day in nearly 40 years. This was no longer just a puzzle. The violence was real. The victim was real. Christina pored over the documents, analyzing every pixel, every handwritten note. But she soon realized that one person, working alone in a bedroom, could only push the boulders so far up the hill. She needed an army. She needed the collective, terrifying power of the internet hive mind. She turned to a community that lived and breathed in the shadows of unsolved mysteries. Christina logged on to read it. She navigated to the massive, sprawling community known as Unresolved Mysteries, a digital gathering place for hundreds of thousands of individuals obsessed with cold cases. Under the username CallMeIce, she laid all her cards on the table. She uploaded the cemetery record. She shared the tragic details from Lieutenant Sylvius's files. She posted the harrowing crime scene photos. She outlined her theory that this young woman had been a victim of catastrophic systemic failure. The response was an absolute tidal wave. The community didn't just passively consume the story. They were fundamentally outraged. This wasn't just a murder mystery to them. It was a glaring, offensive example of institutional incompetence, jurisdictional chaos, horrific record-keeping, and the casual dismissal of a human life. It struck a nerve. Instantly, the digital army mobilized. Users deployed incredibly sophisticated research tactics. They cross-referenced the Strongsville coordinates with missing persons databases from the entire decade of the 1970s. They executed deep-dive Boolean searches to scrape the internet for obscure newspaper clippings. They tore through military records, social security death indexes, and regional archives. The momentum couldn't be contained to a single platform. A user named Migmu carried Christina's explosive research over to Web Sleuths, a highly specialized firm crawling with retired law enforcement officers, ex-military investigators, and obsessive researchers who had a documented history of successfully identifying John and Jane Does. Christina had accidentally triggered a perfect, unstoppable storm. The collaboration between the platforms was a marvel of modern crowdsourcing. Tasks were aggressively divided. One faction hunted through digitized obituaries. Another built massive, complex family trees based on potential matches. They wielded a power that traditional police departments simply could not compete with. A detective might be juggling 30 active homicide cases at once, restricted by city limits and county lines. But the internet has no borders. Thousands of hyper-focused eyes were staring at one single, solitary mystery. While Christina watched her solitary crusade transform into a nationwide phenomenon, a 54-year-old retired CPA in California was quietly reading the forums. His name was Carl Koppelman. Carl was not your average internet sleuth. After retiring from the world of accounting, he had found a deeply unusual, yet profoundly impactful calling. Carl was a volunteer forensic artist. He possessed an incredible, self-taught mastery of digital modeling software and facial anatomy. He spent his days reading autopsy reports, studying skull measurements, and using FBI tissue depth data to literally rebuild the faces of the unidentified dead. He had already helped solve massive, high-profile cases, using his digital brush to breathe life back into the forgotten. When Carl clicked on Christina's post regarding the Strongsville Jane Doe, his initial reaction was bleak. The crime scene photos were a forensic artist's worst nightmare. The skull was heavily degraded, caked in thick Ohio mud. The elements had worked the bone. But the most devastating obstacle was the missing mandible. The lower jaw dictates the entire structure of the lower face, the jawline, the chin, the shape of the cheeks. Furthermore, the absence of teeth meant there was no structural reference for how the lips would sit. And without a single strand of DNA to indicate hair color or texture, Carl was essentially staring at a blank, damaged canvas. For months, Carl looked at the terrifying images of the skull, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the task. He repeatedly told himself that the angles were wrong, that there was simply not enough anatomical data to generate anything resembling an accurate human face. But the story of the nameless girl in the unmarked grave gnawed at his conscience. The sheer injustice of her arousal wouldn't let him sleep. Finally, driven by the same stubborn refusal to quit that had sparked Christina's journey, Carl decided to force the issue. He booted up his sophisticated 3D modeling software. He analyzed every microscopic contour of the remaining bone. He cross-referenced the damaged skull with anatomical textbooks, painstakingly calculating the mathematical probabilities of the missing jaw's size and shape. He estimated the lip positioning based on the 5 remaining jagged teeth. To avoid leading potential witnesses astray, he gave his digital creation a neutral, unassuming brown hair color. It was a grueling, deeply emotional process of educated guesswork and artistic intuition. But when Carl finally stepped back and looked at his monitor, a miracle had occurred. Staring back at him was not a sterile, medical rendering of a skull. It was a young woman. She had soft features. She had kind, gentle eyes. It was a face that commanded empathy. For the first time in over 40 years, the girl from the Rocky River could look back at the world. The haunting image exploded across the true crime forums. Thousands of people shared the reconstruction, hoping the face would trigger a memory in a grieving relative. But the true breakthrough wouldn't come from a forum post. It would come from a completely unrelated, coincidental phone call. In 2016, Carl Koppelman was on the phone with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office, discussing an entirely different set of unidentified remains. During the casual conversation, Carl brought up his intense frustration with the Strongsville Jane Doe case, mentioning his facial reconstruction and the agonizing lack of leads. The official on the other end of the line went quiet. They pulled up their digital archives. "We don't have any record of a Strongsville Jane Doe in our system." Carl was stunned. This wasn't just a missing file. The Strongsville case had never been entered into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. NamUs is the lifeblood of cold case investigations. It is the centralized, federal database that constantly cross-references the missing with the unidentified. It was the very safety net designed to catch victims like the Strongsville Doe. But because of a catastrophic, infuriating clerical error, likely a misspelled name or a jurisdictional miscommunication from the analog days of 1975, she had been completely omitted. She wasn't just forgotten by the public. She was invisible to the very technology built to identify her. This horrifying revelation exposed a systemic rot. If this case had slipped through, how many thousands of other bodies were rotting in potter's fields across the country, absent from the digital grid because of a typo? The error was swiftly corrected. The forensic data, the crime scene details, and Carl Koppelman's haunting facial reconstruction were finally uploaded into the NamUs database. But the trap was set, and it didn't take long to spring. In December of 2016, Sergeant Jeff Smith of the Akron Police Department was sitting at his desk, running routine queries through the NAMA system. He clicked on a newly uploaded file, the Strongsville Jane Doe. His detective's intuition immediately flared. The estimated age, the geographic proximity to Akron, the time frame of the discovery. It all aligned perfectly with a dusty missing persons file he had reviewed from September of 1974. A 17-year-old girl who had vanished into thin air. Sergeant Smith pulled the physical file. He laid the 1974 photograph of the missing teenager next to his computer screen displaying Carl Koppelman's digital reconstruction. A chill ran down the detective's spine. Despite the impossible odds, despite the missing jawbone and the degraded skull, the resemblance was absolutely staggering. The soft features, the eyes, the proportions. When Carl Koppelman eventually saw the side-by-side comparison, his reaction was instantaneous. She looked like my drawing. The ghost finally had a name. Right. Linda Marie Pagano. But a visual match is not a legal identification. To give Linda her name back officially, to rewrite the cemetery ledger, the investigators needed irrefutable, scientific proof. They needed DNA. And to get DNA, they had to wake the dead. In October of 2017, heavy machinery and solemn investigators descended upon Memorial Gardens Cemetery. The task was a nightmare. Potter's Field was a disorganized, chaotic patch of earth with abysmal record-keeping. Using highly advanced ground-penetrating radar from the University of Akron, they scanned the soil, hunting for anomalies that matched the 1975 burial logs. The incompetence of the past continued to haunt the present. Their first exhumation attempt was a failure. They pulled the wrong body from the earth, a brutal reminder of how casually the unidentified word is discarded. But they recalibrated. They dug again. And finally, they found her. The remains labeled unknown white female bones were carefully lifted from the cold Ohio dirt. Bone fragments were immediately shipped to the highly specialized University of North Texas DNA laboratory. Because the remains were so severely degraded, standard DNA extraction was impossible. Scientists had to rely on mitochondrial DNA testing, a complex process that sequences the genetic material passed exclusively down the maternal line. They extracted the ancient DNA and compared it against fresh cheek swabs taken from Linda Pagano's surviving siblings. While the scientists worked their magic in the sterile labs, investigators began to piece together the tragic narrative of Linda's life. Who was she before she became a mystery? Born on April 11th, 1957, Linda was the youngest of 3 children. She was tiny, standing just 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighing barely 100 pounds, earning her the affectionate, if outdated, nickname Midge. She had bright blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and an independent, fierce spirit that contradicted her small frame. She was a good kid. She worked a part-time job at the local law and town match, meticulously saving her paychecks to buy her absolute pride and joy, a gold Mustang. She stayed out of trouble, loved music, and dreamed of a life bigger than the city limits of Akron. But her home life was a powdered keg waiting for a spark. Linda adored her mother, but she lived in constant, suffocating tension with her stepfather, Byron Claflin. Byron was a bartender with a notoriously short fuse and a heavy drinking habit. He ruled his household with an iron fist, and as Linda approached her 18th birthday, her natural desire for independence clashed violently with his need for absolute control. The fuse was finally lit on the last weekend of August, 1974. On August 31st, Linda was buzzing with excitement. She had scored tickets to see Crosby, Stills, Nash Young at the massive Cleveland Stadium. She piled into her prized gold Mustang, picked up her boyfriend Steve Wilson and a few friends, and drove into the city. The concert was legendary. 80,000 screaming fans. 3 hours of electric, life-altering music. Friends later recalled that Linda was glowing that night. She felt entirely on top of the world. The final song the band played that night was Ohio, Neil Young's Dark, morning anthem about the Kent State shootings that had happened just miles away. The bitter, sickening irony is impossible to ignore. As Linda sang along to a song about the tragic deaths of young people in Ohio, she had less than 12 hours to live before becoming an Ohio tragedy herself. The concert ended late. Traffic out of the stadium was a nightmare. By the time Linda dropped off her friends and drove back to Akron, the clock had pushed to 4. Like 0 a.m. It was September 1st. When she finally turned the key in the lock of her apartment, she wasn't greeted by silence. She was greeted by a predator. Byron Claflin was awake. He had been drinking heavily, pacing the floor, allowing his rage over Linda's late arrival to boil over into a drunken fury. The moment she stepped inside, the apartment erupted. The argument was explosive, terrifying, and final. In a blind rage, Byron screamed at the 17-year-old girl to get out. He threw her into the early morning darkness and told her to never, ever come back. Like, the heavy door slammed shut, and Linda Marie Pagano stepped into the void. She had no money. She had nowhere to go. There were no cell phones to ping, no digital footprint to track, just a vulnerable teenager walking the dark streets of Akron. She was reported missing the very next day. But she was gone, erased. For 44 years, her family suffered the unimaginable agony of the unknown. Her brother, Michael, had even called the police in 1975 when he read a tiny blurb about bones found by the Rocky River, begging them to check if it was his sister. The police casually dismissed him. They told him the details didn't match. They slammed the door on his closure. And Byron Claflin, the violently angry, drunken man who was the last person to ever see her alive, he remained the prime suspect in the eyes of the family. Mike. But without a body, without a crime scene, the police could do nothing. Byron took his secrets to the grave, dying in 1990, without ever facing a judge or a jury. Fast forward to June 29th, 2018. The wait was finally over. The results from the University of North Texas arrived. The mitochondrial DNA from the muddy bones was a definitive, scientific match to the Pagano family. Combined with the age, height, and Carl Koppelman's terrifyingly accurate sketch, the truth was undeniable. The remains found by the teenage boys in 1975 belonged to Linda Marie Pagano. Christina Skates was sitting at home, playing a video game, when the phone rang. When she heard the news, the years of obsessive searching, the sleepless nights, the frustration of hitting bureaucratic walls, it all crashed down on her at once. She choked back tears. A 23-year-old college student had achieved the impossible. On July 12, 2018, law enforcement held a massive press conference. They stood before the cameras and officially erased line 82,483 from the cemetery ledger. The Strongsville Jane Doe was dead. Linda Pagano was alive in memory. For her brother Michael, the revelation was a crushing wave of grief and overwhelming relief. "I thought I was in a dream," he told reporters, his voice trembling. "I thought I would die wondering." Michael made it a point to track down Christina Skates. He met the young woman face to face, looking into the eyes of the stranger whose relentless, stubborn curiosity had given him his sister back. It was a profound, silent acknowledgement that sometimes true justice requires the obsessive dedication of the people, not just the badge. In January of 2019, the fragmented bones were cremated bones. Linda Marie Pagano was finally laid to rest in Holy Cross Cemetery, buried right beside her mother. She was surrounded by the family that had never, ever stopped loving her. But this story does not end with handcuffs and a prison cell. When the identity was confirmed, the case was immediately upgraded to an active homicide investigation. But detectives inherited a nightmare. The evidence was 50 years old. The prime suspect, Byron Claflin, had been dead for nearly 30 years. Linda's boyfriend from that night, Steve Wilson, had completely vanished from all public records. Authorities didn't even know if he was still breathing. The brutal reality of cold cases set in. As Michael Pagano bitterly accepted, we'll know in our hearts who did it, but we'll never be able to prove it. The killer, in all likelihood, escaped the vengeance of the law. Yet, the shockwaves of Linda's case triggered a massive, systemic reckoning. The infuriating clerical era that kept her out of NAMA's forced police departments across Ohio and the entire country to audit their forgotten files. Investigators discovered hundreds of John and Jane Does from the 70 seconds on 80 seconds who had never been digitized. The system was broken, and Christina Skates had shined a blinding spotlight on the cracks. Her meticulous, responsible use of the internet hive mind revolutionized how law enforcement views civilian investigators. Police departments realized that they didn't have to fight the digital army. They could weaponize it. The collective obsession of thousands of people on Reddit and web sleuths could process information at a speed that traditional detectives could only dream of. Christina never sought the spotlight. She didn't want a book deal or a television show. She only wanted to correct a profound wrong. She took a string of clinical, terrifying words, unknown white female bones, and she transformed them back into a human being. She gave back the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the love of rock and roll, and the gold Mustang. She gave back the humanity that the darkness had tried so desperately to steal. So the next time you are scrolling through the internet late at night, remember Linda. Remember that buried beneath the digital noise, there are real ghosts waiting in the dark, waiting for someone stubborn enough, brave enough, and obsessive enough to look down into the abyss and call them by their name. Thank you for listening tonight, you beautiful, intellectually minded freaks. Keep your doors locked. Keep your eyes open. Until next time, stay out of the woods.